What would you do if the only thing you owned in the world was a $2 iron box that nobody, not the auctioneer, not the blacksmith, not the bank that once owned it, could get open? For Clara Doyle, 19 years old and freshly cast out of the only house she had left, that wasn't a question. It was Tuesday. She had $14 sewn into the hem of her coat, a leather roll of her late father's locksmith tools, and a bid card raised at a dusty estate auction for a scorched, dented safe that 3 grown men couldn't lift without cursing. The auctioneer sold it to her for $2 because nobody else wanted the weight of hauling off a dead bank's junk. Everyone in Larkin's Ford agreed it was worthless. A relic. Scrap iron with a stuck door. They were wrong. Inside that safe was a secret 22 years locked in the dark. One that would cost a powerful man his name, and give a friendless girl a town. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Origin and mentorship. Before any of that, there was Miller's Bend, a river town small enough that everyone knew whose smoke was whose, and there was Thomas Doyle, who could open anything. Not by force. Thomas Doyle didn't believe in force. He used to say any fool with a sledge could open a lock, and any fool with a sledge would ruin what was behind it. He believed in listening. He kept a shop 2 doors down from the feed store, a narrow room that smelled of oil and hot metal, and on its wall hung more keys than most men see in a lifetime, sorted by ward and by wear, each one a small solved puzzle he'd never bothered to take down. Clara had grown up on a stool in the corner of that shop, 6 years old and then 10 and then 16, watching her father's hands. He taught her the way you teach someone who's already paying attention, not with lectures, but by handing her the tension wrench and saying, "Feel it. Don't force it. It'll tell you when it's ready." He taught her the names of things most girls in Miller's Bend never learned. Wards, levers, tumblers, the false gate that a cheap lock uses to fool an impatient hand. He taught her to read a mechanism the way other fathers taught daughters to read weather, as something that spoke if you were quiet enough to hear it. The tool he gave her outright, the summer she turned 15, was his own tension wrench, a slim, hand-filed strip of spring steel, the handle wrapped in a cracked curl of oiled leather worn smooth by his thumb. "A lock only needs one honest hand on it," he told her, pressing it into her palm. "Yours is honest enough." She kept it on her the way other girls kept a locket. It rode in the seam of her boot, and later, in the lining of a coat pocket sewn tight enough that nothing, not weather, not grief, not an uncle's ledger, could take it from her. Have you ever been handed something small that turned out to be the only inheritance that mattered? The loss and the cold relative. Thomas Doyle died the winter Clara was 18, of a lung fever that took him in 11 days and left the shop stove cold for the first time in 12 years. There was no dramatic scene at the end. Just a good man growing quieter, and then not speaking at all, and Clara sitting by the bed with his tension wrench already in her pocket, as if some part of her had known to keep it close. What Thomas Doyle had not left behind was money. The shop's lease reverted to its owner. The tools, the debts, and Clara herself passed, by the plain arithmetic of family obligation, to her father's older brother, Silas Doyle, a dry goods merchant 3 counties over who had not visited Miller's Bend in 9 years and had, by his own account, enough mouths already. The 8 months Clara spent under Silas's roof were not cruel in any way a court could name. They were simply cold, the way a ledger is cold. She ate what was left after the family ate. She slept in the storeroom above the shop, among crates of nails and bolt cloth. She was given chores instead of conversation, and when she was given conversation, it was usually about what she cost. The end came in Silas's back office, at a roll-top desk stacked with receipt books, on a gray March morning that smelled of coffee and cold ash. Silas did not raise his voice. He never did. $14, he said, sliding a small stack of bills across the desk, along with a rail ticket. That's your father's share of the estate, less what you've cost me in boarding since November. Call it settled. He closed the ledger as he said it, the way a man closes a door he doesn't intend to open again. Clara did not argue. She had learned, in 8 months, that arguing with a ledger only cost you more page. She folded the $14 into her coat hem that night, packed a single canvas bag, 2 dresses, a hairbrush, her father's worn primer on lock mechanisms, a half loaf of bread, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, the tension wrench. She left before breakfast. Nobody came to the door. What does it cost a man to become a closed account to the people who are supposed to love him? Silas Doyle was about to find out, though it would take 22 years of somebody else's secret to teach him. The rail line west of the bend ran 3 days through country that got drier and harder to love with every mile, green hills giving way to scrub, then scrub giving way to rock, until the train seemed to be crossing the ribs of the earth itself. Clara watched it all from a hard bench seat, her canvas bag between her boots, the tension wrench a small, steady weight against her hip. She got off at Larkin's Ford because the ticket ran out there, not because she had a plan. It was a mining town gone half quiet. The silver had thinned a decade back, and what remained was a scatter of clapboard buildings, a stamp mill standing idle on the ridge, and a boarded-up brick building on the main street with Larkin Mining and Trust still legible in flaking gold paint above the door. A fire, she was told, had gutted the bank's records room some 22 years back, and it had limped along after that, failing for good not long after. The town was holding off the last of the bank's fixtures at auction that very week. Furniture, a scorched vault door, ledgers nobody wanted, and one iron safe too damaged and too heavy to be worth hauling off as anything but scrap. "You don't want that one, miss," the auctioneer's man told her, not unkindly, as she stood looking at the dented box. Doors seized solid. Every locksmith who's come through in 20 years has walked away from it. It's $2 because nobody'll give you $2 back out of it. Clara looked at the char marks along its base, the dent where someone had tried a sledge and given up, the maker's plate, worn but not gone, stamped W and CO. She thought of her father's hands. She raised 2 fingers, and the safe was hers. What was it, do you think, that made a girl with $14 to her name spend 2 of them on something every expert had already given up on? Settling in and first doubt. The shed she rented behind the old livery cost her 50 cents a week and came with a dirt floor, a leaning door, and a workbench somebody's grandfather had built for a trade nobody remembered. It took her 4 days just to make the place fit to work in, sweeping out mouse nests, patching the roof with tin scraps a boy sold her for a nickel, hauling water from the town pump until her palms split and recalloused into something closer to her father's hands than her own had ever been. Getting the safe from the auction lot to the shed took Pete Alsop's mule team, and a plank ramp and 45 minutes of Clara directing the operation with a patience the men hauling it clearly hadn't expected from a girl her age. By the time it sat square in the corner of her shed, she had exactly $9 left, a bruised shoulder, and a locked box that hadn't opened for 2 decades. The nights were the hardest. She would sit on the shed's dirt floor with a cold supper and her father's primer open on her knees, rereading passages she already knew by heart, and some nights the wind through the shed's gaps made her wonder, plainly and without self-pity, whether she had spent her last $2 on a mistake. Larkin's Ford was not going to hand her a living. Nobody there had asked for a locksmith. Nobody there, she sometimes thought, had asked for her at all. It was on one of those low evenings, sitting outside the shed as the light went copper over the ridge, that Amos Teague first spoke to her. He was an old blacksmith, retired now to a bench outside the mercantile, hands still scarred from 40 years at a forge, and he'd watched the safe go by on Pete's ramp with an expression she couldn't read. "That safe's kept its mouth shut for 22 years, he said, not quite looking at her. "It didn't do that by accident, girl. Things get locked that tight for one of 2 reasons. Somebody wanted to keep something out, or somebody wanted to make dead sure it'd only ever be found by hands patient enough to deserve it." He said nothing else that night. Clara turned the words over for days without understanding them. She had no way of knowing yet how exactly right he was. The first clue. It was in her 2nd week of careful, unhurried work on the seized mechanism, cleaning 2 decades of rust and fire scale from the boltwork, coaxing the tumblers back into something like motion, that Clara noticed the safe was heavier than it had any right to be. Her father had taught her to weigh a thing not on a scale but in the way it moved, the way it settled when you shifted it, and something about this box didn't sit the way an empty iron shell should sit. She rapped her knuckles along the inside of the open outer door, then along the back wall of the compartment behind the jammed inner door she still hadn't cracked, and there, low, on the right side, a hand's width from the floor, the sound changed. Not the flat knock of solid iron. A shorter, higher note. Hollow. She sat back on her heels in the lamplight and thought of her father, years ago, walking her through a strongbox a river captain had brought into the shop. A box with exactly this trick, a false wall built to hide a second, smaller compartment behind the first. Fireproof safes made after a bad fire, he'd told her, tapping the memory awake now like he was standing beside her. Sometimes get built with two skins. One to fool the flames. Sometimes, one to fool everybody else. The maker's plate came back to her then, W and CO. And something in her chest went very still. This safe hadn't just survived the fire that gutted Larkin Mining and Trust. It might have been built for one. What do you do when a hunch that quiet turns out to be the truest thing you've heard in weeks? The physical discovery. Getting through a jammed, fire-warped locking bar built by a man who clearly understood locks as well as she did was not going to happen with a hammer, and Clara never once reached for one. She started at the outer door first, working the seized boltwork free the way her father had taught her, heating the striker plate just enough to loosen fire-swollen metal without warping the mechanism further, easing penetrating oil into the bolt channels a drop at a time over 2 full days, patient as rain. When the outer door finally swung on its hinge, groaning, it revealed the inner compartment, scorched, sealed, and behind it, the plain iron back wall where the hollow knock had sounded. She spent a full evening simply looking at that wall before she touched it, running her fingertips along every seam, the way her father used to run his along a lock's face before ever inserting a pick, because a wall built to hide something is still built by hands, and hands leave a rhythm if you know how to read it. She found it near the base. A seam so fine it had passed for a manufacturing joint to every locksmith who'd walked away from this job before her. Not a weld. A fitted panel. The panel itself was locked from behind by a second, smaller mechanism, a lever tumbler set into a recessed plate no bigger than her palm, the kind of fine work you'd only build if you wanted it found by someone with a locksmith's hands and nobody else's. She worked it the way her father had taught her to work anything stubborn. Tension wrench first, steady and light, letting the mechanism tell her its own shape rather than guessing at it. Her father's leather-wrapped wrench, the one that had ridden in her coat hem through 2 counties of loss, sat in her right hand while her left guided a slim steel pick along levers that hadn't moved in 2 decades. One lever gave. Then, a second. On the third, something inside the little mechanism sighed. An old, dry, mechanical exhale, like the box itself had been holding its breath since the fire, and the panel shifted a half-inch under her palm. She sat back on her heels, hands trembling for the first time in weeks, and looked at the dark gap she'd opened. Then, silence. The hidden room and the letter. The compartment behind the panel was small, no bigger than a lap desk, and lined in cedar that had somehow survived the fire hole, still faintly fragrant after 22 years sealed shut. Clara lifted her lamp and looked inside. There was a canvas mine payroll pouch, heavier than it looked, its drawstring brittle with age. There was a slim ledger book, its leather cover cracked but its pages intact, filled edge to edge in a small, careful hand. There was a hand-carved wooden bird, a wren. Its wings worked with a patience that told her whoever made it had loved the person it was made for. And tucked beside the ledger, in an oilcloth wrapping that had kept the damp out for over 2 decades, there was a folded, sealed letter. To whoever finds this, the outside read, in the same careful hand as the ledger. Clara broke the wax with fingers that had gone very still, and read. The letter was from a man named Elias Whitfield, and it told her, in plain, unhurried sentences, exactly what she had found. Whitfield had been the safe-maker and paymaster for the Larkin Mining Company, a man who understood locks the way her own father had, and he had built this very safe himself, double-walled, to protect the miners' payroll after 2 smaller thefts had already gone unexplained. What he'd discovered, going back through the books alone one night, was that the thefts hadn't been outside jobs at all. They were the bank's own owner, a man named Josiah Colton, quietly skimming the payroll and preparing to let Whitfield take the blame when the shortfall was finally noticed. Whitfield had recovered what he could of the stolen gold before Colton could cover his tracks, hidden it here with the true ledger as proof, and intended to bring both before the mines board within the week. The fire came first, a fire the letter did not accuse anyone of setting outright, but described, in careful and devastating restraint, as too convenient to be honest. Whitfield died in it. His wife, the letter said, had died of a fever not long before, grieving a stillborn child, and it was her likeness the wren was carved to remember. The only softness, he wrote, that this hard trade had ever given him. If you have found this, the letter closed, you did it with patient hands and no help from anyone who wanted it easy. That is exactly the kind of hand I built this safe to wait for. Use what's here to see the men paid what was stolen from them, and to make something living out of a place that has only known ash. I have no family left to give this to. I give it, instead, to whoever earns it. Clara sat with the letter in her lap for a long time before she moved again. What would you do, with a dead man's 22-year-old trust suddenly resting in your two hands? Before we go further, if stories like this one are the kind you come back for, consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think. The choice and the community forms. Clara could have taken the payroll gold and left Larkin's Ford the next morning on the first train east, and not one soul in town would ever have known to stop her. She thought about it exactly once, for the length of one long night, and then she didn't think about it again. What she did instead was walk the ledger and 10 of Whitfield's original gold coins straight to the town clerk's office and lay out, plainly and without drama, exactly what she'd found and exactly what it proved. She asked for the surviving miners' names, the ones still living, and the families of the ones who weren't, so the payroll could finally reach the hands it had always been meant for. Word moves fast in a town that small. Within the week, Amos Teague showed up at her shed at dawn and, without a word about payment, spent 2 days reinforcing her forge and rebuilding her leaning door on iron hinges that would outlast them both. Widow Odessa Marsh began leaving a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves on Clara's step every Thursday, never knocking, never asking anything in return. Pete Alsop hauled her a proper workbench from the old bank's salvage at no charge, muttering only that a girl who does honest work oughtn't do it on a busted table. None of them needed her gratitude, and none of them offered friendship in words. They offered it the way Larkin's Ford knew how, through labor, through bread, through a fair price made fairer. Clara used the recovered gold exactly as Whitfield's letter had asked, back wages paid in full to 6 surviving miners and 4 widows, a small sum set aside to reopen the bank building itself as an honest office of trade, and, because Amos Teague pointed out, dryly, that a town with a locksmith this good oughtn't lose her to somewhere better. A proper shopfront built onto her shed with her father's name and her own stenciled together above the door. Within 2 months, Clara Doyle had gone from a girl nobody in Larkin's Ford had asked for, to the only person in town who could be trusted with every strongbox, till, and safe worth protecting. The reckoning. Josiah Colton had died years before any of this came to light, but his son Ezra had not, and Ezra Colton ran the Colton Mercantile and Loan on the very same street, quietly buying up notes and land from families who couldn't pay, the same slow, patient way his father once emptied a mine payroll one skim at a time. It was Ezra who had tried, weeks earlier, to buy the worthless old safe out from under Clara before the auction even closed, offering her $5 to walk away from it, an offer that, in hindsight, told her more than he'd ever meant it to. There was no shouting when the truth surfaced. Clara never once stood in the street and named him. She simply gave the ledger to the town clerk, and the clerk gave it to the county recorder, and within a month it was simply known, the way true things eventually become known in small towns, that the Colton fortune had been built on a theft from dead men who couldn't answer for themselves. Nobody needed to run Ezra Colton out of Larkin's Ford. His customers did that quietly enough on their own, taking their notes and their trust to the honest little office Clara had helped reopen down the street. Within the season, the Colton Mercantile and Loan closed its doors for want of anyone willing to owe it money, and Ezra Colton left town on a morning train much like the one that had once brought Clara in, though nobody stood on the platform to see him off. He had never raised a hand to her. He had never needed to. And in the end, it was not force that undid him, but a letter written by a man he'd never met, kept honest for 22 years by a lock he could never have opened himself. Resolution montage. A year moves faster than you'd think, once a life finally has somewhere to root. By the following spring, the shopfront above Clara's shed read Doyle & Co. Locks, safes, honest work, the letters painted by Amos Teague's own hand as a gift she hadn't asked for. She kept regular hours now, 6 days a week, with a line of customers that ranged from ranchers needing a new strongbox to the reopened bank itself, which paid her a standing retainer to service its vault twice a year. Widow Odessa Marsh still left bread on Thursdays, though now Clara left a jar of honey on the widow's step in return, and neither of them had ever once discussed the arrangement out loud. Pete Alsop hauled freight for her at a standing rate, and Amos Teague took his coffee, most mornings, on the bench just outside her shop door, watching the street the way old men watch things they've decided are worth watching. The miners' families she'd made whole with Whitfield's gold had, one by one, become the steadiest fixtures of her days. A widow's son apprenticed to her that fall, quick-handed and patient in a way that reminded her, some mornings, almost unbearably, of herself 2 years before. Larkin's Ford had not become a rich town. It had become, instead, an honest one, which Clara had come to understand was worth a good deal more. On a quiet evening in late autumn, with the shop closed and the lamp turned low, Clara sat at her workbench and set 2 small objects side by side in the pool of light. On the left, her father's tension wrench, leather-wrapped, thumb-worn, carried through every mile of the worst year of her life. On the right, Elias Whitfield's small carved wren, wings still fine after 22 years in the dark. One man had taught her patient hands. The other had trusted patient hands enough to wait 2 decades for the right ones to find him. She had never met Elias Whitfield, and she thought of him, most nights, almost as clearly as she thought of her father. 2 men, a generation and a fortune apart, who had each given her, in their own quiet way, everything they had left to give. She was 19, and she had been cast out with $14 and a $2 safe nobody else would touch. She thought, turning the wren over once in the lamplight before setting it carefully back on its shelf, that she had never once in her life felt richer than this. Thank you for staying with us for this story of patience, and what it means to be trusted by someone who never got to meet you. If you were moved by Clara's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who's ever been told that what they had wasn't worth the trouble of keeping. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. And before you go, we'd love to know, what have you found value in that everyone around you had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. Until then, be well.